Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Terry Pratchett. Today's thread running through everything is Terry Pratchett's clarity. He used fantasy to talk about the real world. He spotted the internet's credibility problem before most people did. And even when he was dealing with Alzheimer's, he kept pushing for honesty, dignity, and control. There's also a lovely through line of craft and community here. The lost early stories, the relentless writing discipline, the way fans kept building meaning around his work, and the very firm line he drew around what should happen to it after he died. Discworld started with Pratchett having fun with sword and sorcery cliches, and then over 41 novels, it turned into something much bigger. He kept the fantasy setting, but he started dropping in things like policing, guns, newspapers, banking, the post office, semaphore towers, steam power, all the machinery of modern life landing in a medieval-ish world. That setup let him do satire with a bit of sideways vision. You're watching trolls and witches and city guards deal with social upheaval, but really you're looking at politics, class, economics, bureaucracy, technology, and how people adapt when institutions change. Pratchett was very clear that fantasy wasn't some lesser shelf of literature, because it had wizards on it. For him, fantasy was a way of seeing reality from a different angle, and that angle could make the real world easier to understand, not harder. One of the more eerie Pratchett moments comes from a 1995 conversation with Bill Gates, where he more or less anticipated one of the defining problems of the internet. His concern wasn't simply that false things would appear online. Of course they would. It was that bad information could sit right next to serious research and borrow some of its authority just by proximity. He used the example of Holocaust denial showing up alongside established history, and the issue was this false parody, this misleading sense that evidence-based knowledge and fabricated claims were just two equally valid options on the menu. Gates was more optimistic that online authorities would eventually sort, index, and verify information better than print could. Pratchett's point was more human. Ordinary users still have to judge what they're looking at, and that's not easy. Looking back, it reads as a very early diagnosis of the fake news era, before we even had the language for it. It's easy to talk about Pratchett as if the books just arrived in a burst of comic brilliance, but the pace alone tells you how disciplined he was. After becoming a full-time author in 1987, he generally produced 2 books a year while also doing appearances, promotion, and answering fans. His working target was roughly 1,000 words a day. He treated writing as work, plain and simple, not joyless work, but work. And his advice to writers was equally practical. Read constantly, including outside your genre, and don't write because you're chasing money. He called money an unavoidable consequence, which is a wonderfully dry way to put it. Even later, when his output slowed to 1 book a year, the books kept landing hard. Snuff sold 55,000 UK hardbacks in its first 3 days. There was also a surprise second archive hiding in plain sight. Between 1972 and 1984, Pratchett published around 20 newspaper stories under the pseudonym Patrick Kearns, his mother's maiden name. Because the byline wasn't his, biographers had taken some stretches of his early career as periods of inactivity. Fans eventually identified the stories, and they were collected in 2023 as a stroke of the pen. The Lost Stories. That discovery matters because it changes the picture of his development. Instead of a few gaps and jumps, you see a much more continuous, prolific young writer already practicing the habits that would define the later career. After his 2007 diagnosis with early-onset Alzheimer's, Pratchett did something that took real nerve. He made the illness visible. His form was posterior cortical atrophy, which mainly affected vision, typing, and other physical abilities while leaving his cognitive life comparatively intact for years. That matters, because it pushed back against the flattening way people often imagine dementia. He kept writing through dictation, speech recognition software, and help from Rob Wilkins. He also used his public profile to campaign for research, donating £494,000 and pointing out that Alzheimer's research funding was only about 3% of cancer research funding. He brought the subject to television in BBC documentaries, including Living with Alzheimer's, which won a BAFTA. He didn't present dementia as an abstraction. He made people look at what it actually was and what it was not. From there, it's not hard to understand why he also became such a prominent advocate for what he preferred to call assisted death. His argument was that people with serious, ultimately fatal illnesses should be able to choose a peaceful medically assisted death rather than be forced through unbearable decline. In his 2010 Richard Dimbleby lecture, Shaking Hands with Death, he called for a regulated system with assisted death tribunals. Because reading had become difficult, Tony Robinson delivered much of the lecture for him. It's also worth being precise here. Pratchett died naturally in 2015 from complications of Alzheimer's. Assisted death was part of his public argument about dignity and choice, not a description of how he died. His broader philosophy was strikingly consistent with all of this. Pratchett identified as an atheist and a humanist, but he wasn't cartoonishly dismissive about religion. He could see that religion had social and evolutionary purpose, and he admired parts of the New Testament, even while saying the Old and New Testaments didn't fit together for him as one coherent story. The line that really sums up his outlook comes from Nation. It is better to build a seismograph than to worship the volcano. That's Pratchett in one sentence. Understand reality, respond to reality, and don't mistake comfort for truth. So when rumors floated around that he'd become religious after hearing his dead father's voice, he clarified that he understood it as memory and elation, not as proof he'd found God. Pratchett was just as clear about what should happen to his work after his death. He explicitly instructed that unfinished writing should be destroyed rather than published or used to continue Discworld. His daughter Rihanna, who became custodian of the franchise, said she had no plans to continue the series either. And in 2017, Rob Wilkins carried out the instruction in unforgettable fashion by having Pratchett's hard drive crushed under a steamroller, even though it contained about 10 known unfinished titles and fragments of other projects. There's something fittingly Pratchett about the image, a steamroller over the hard drive. Funny for half a second, and then very serious underneath. The point was that an author's wishes mattered more than squeezing every last commercial drop out of the archive. His relationship with fans had always been unusually open and participatory. He was an early regular internet user, posted on alt.fan.pratchett from 1992, went to conventions, and had a reputation for continuing book signings long after the official end time. After his death, fans carried one of Discworld's own ideas into real digital culture, with the web header X-Clacks overhead, GNU Terry Pratchett. In the books, the clack system keeps a person from being forgotten so long as their name continues to be sent. Fans turned that fictional memorial into a real one. A survey in June 2015 found the tribute header on about 84,000 websites. That's a remarkable afterlife for a writer's idea, and also a very Pratchett kind of memorial, communal, clever, and practical enough to actually work. Taken together, all of this makes Pratchett feel even larger than the already large stack of books. He was funny, yes, but also exacting about truth, humane about suffering, and very alert to how systems shape ordinary lives. And maybe that's why he lasts so well. The jokes are still there, but so is the signal underneath them. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.